Once again, thanks for joining us today. My name is Barbara Iverson, and I am the moderator today for the dialogue. I'm an expert in interpersonal skills based in Berlin. In addition to the international sign interpretation as part of our dialogue today, all of us appearing on camera will be giving a short description of ourselves for those participating who are visually impaired. I am a white woman with medium length, wavy blonde hair, and I'm wearing a black shirt. So with this series, we want to continue challenging the civil society sector with inspiring conversations based on the constant change that digitalization brings to our societies. Each discussion will be a call to action for SCOs to take a more active role in shaping our digital future. So today, we are putting a spotlight on legitimate self-defense, civil society, digital surveillance. So I'm pleased to introduce, we expected to have 3 panelists. I think one of them has not joined us yet, so I'm going to mention her name, and then when she's here, she'll join. But the first is Nalucha Nganga from Frontline Defenders, and she'll be joining us later. But we also have Francesca Bosco from CyberPeace Institute, who's currently in Geneva, and Matt Mahmoudi from Amnesty International is coming to us from Copenhagen. So we're looking forward to what they'll be sharing with us today. And now we're going to take a few minutes to have them share a little bit more about who they are and what they're doing in this topic-related field. So Francesca, would you please turn on your camera and unmute yourself, describe yourself briefly for visually impaired folks, and share with us about who you are and the perspective of the CyberPeace Institute. Hi, Francesca.
Thank you so much, Barbara, and thanks so much to all people that are joining us today. I'm Francesca Bosco from the CyberPeace Institute, connecting from Geneva, Switzerland. I'm white, long brown hair, wearing a black shirt and a black jacket. The CyberPeace Institute is an NGO whose mission is to reduce the harm from cyber attacks on people's lives worldwide, starting from the most vulnerable. And the first question that we ask ourselves is, who are the most vulnerable? And one of the main focus of the work of the Institute has been to support the critical actors in our society, NGOs, so other civil society organizations. In fact, non-governmental organizations, NGOs, including humanitarian and development organizations, make a vital contribution to humanity because they assist and protect the people around the globe. At the same time, unfortunately, also because the digital transformation process that is indeed enabling them in further enhance basically their activities, it's also kind of like representing a danger for the organization themselves, but also for their beneficiaries, their donors, and potentially their extended network of partners. Why they are interesting targets? Well, they are interesting targets because of the work they do, also in highly sensitive contexts, in time of peace and in time of war. They are interesting because of the funds that they manage, the sensitive data that they're hosting and processing. These organizations are providing critical services to populations and vulnerable communities as well. I would like to share briefly some observations out of the work related to collecting, analyzing attacks against a civil society organization and also assisting them. Some trends that we have observed at the CyberPeace Institute is that I would say that in the last 3 years, cyber criminals and state actors have accessed systems and personal records, stolen millions of dollars of donations, carried out surveillance operations, and led misinformation and disinformation campaigns, specifically targeting NGOs. We observed attacks. I mean, the data that I'm presenting today are kind of like partial, and out of the observation that we did between July 2020 and June 2022, And the CyberPeace Institute recorded at least 157 cases of cyber incidents specifically impacting the nonprofit sector, for which data was publicly available. I would also open a parenthesis before I mention specifically in time of peace and in times of war, because one of our publicly available platform is the platform that is monitoring the attacks against the civilian infrastructure and civilian objects in the context of the conflict in Ukraine. And out of this, if you can search it yourself, and we have, for example, recorded 2 specific cases of attacks against civil society organizations, both from March this year. One specifically on credential phishing campaigns against multiple US-based NGOs. Basically, somebody was impersonating military personnel to extort money for rescuing relatives in Ukraine. And another specific campaign of malware attacks against NGOs, by which Amazon reported seeing several situations where malware has been specifically targeted at charities, NGOs, and other aid organizations in order to spread confusion and cause a disruption. I'm mentioning this because out of, let's say, I think that one important aspect is trying to understand that clearly what's happening in cyberspace has a physical impact, again, both in terms of like peace and unfortunately, in this case, in times of war. And also one other, let's say, trend that we have observed is that in addition to traditional cybersecurity challenges like malware, phishing, ransomware, password attacks, NGOs are often targeted by offensive cyber capabilities such as spyware. And unfortunately, pretty famous is the NSO group's Pegasus spyware that basically can turn any affected smartphone into a remote microphone and camera, spying on its own owner, while also offering to the hacker, usually in the forms of like state intelligence or, I mean, unfortunately, rogue law enforcement agencies, full access to files, messages, and of course, the user's location. We have, I mean, the pretty famous NSO group's Pegasus case dated back almost to August 2016, when researchers at the Citizen Lab discovered this type of spyware deployed to target the device of Hamed Mansour, a prominent UAE-based human rights defender. And after that, many other civil society organizations, human rights activists, and journalists were targeted. I would like to share briefly, after the sort of like setting the scene, also a couple of considerations when it comes to civil society preparedness and what we can do about it, let's say, collectively, how we can basically improve the current situation. In terms of preparedness, again, out of the data that we have observed and collected, but also thanks to our program, I will tell you a little bit more about it right after, by which we assist civil society organizations. We were able to have a sort of like quick mapping and understanding of the level of preparedness and also which are the main challenges that civil society organizations are facing. So first of all, the cybersecurity posture and overall vulnerability remains a problem. So very few NGOs have completed, for example, have completed a general security assessment, have, for example, cyber insurance, or have two-factor authentications activated and implemented throughout all their platform. Or, for example, they have a limited incident response plan that is not always reviewed and updated. Challenges in terms of financial and human resources are definitely one of the main kind of like factor for vulnerability. What we can do. I'm just sharing with you a couple of like food for thoughts also for our discussion. So on one hand, we need to enhance awareness and understanding. So thanks, for example, to dialogue like the one of today. So, and we need to do this collaborating with other actors. Practical example, we supported in the development of the digital violence platform together with the forensic architecture, Amnesty, and the Citizen Lab. So to show, basically, visualize the impact of and documenting the different cases of NSO's operations. Let's say, with our own capabilities, we processed more than 100 requests of detection of Pegasus within International Geneva during the Pegasus project. And we called with other organizations, together with Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and Access Now, an international call for a moratorium to limiting the sale, transfer, and the use of abusive power. Is it enough? No. We assist the civil society organization thanks to our CyberPeace Builders program, by which we support the civil society organization in enhancing their cybersecurity posture and capabilities. I leave it here, and I'm happy to further the discussion afterwards.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Francesca. Yeah, we'll come back to this because I know that you kept that. You have plenty more examples to talk about, so we'll come back to it. You can turn off your camera for now, and then I will ask Matt to turn on your camera and unmute yourself and give us a short description of what you look like, and then share about who you are and the perspective of Amnesty International. Hi, Matt.
Hi, Barb. Thank you so much. My name is Matt Mahmoudi. I am a brown man with medium long hair and very large glasses. And I hail from Amnesty's Technology and Human Rights program, where I am a researcher and advisor on artificial intelligence and human rights. In my everyday, I head up our work on banning facial recognition technologies globally, and have tended to focus on the ways in which facial recognition technologies in particular affect protesters who are attempting to exercise their right to freedom of assembly and expression, and how it affects in particular historically marginalized communities, including racialized communities who are working on racial justice. So amongst other things, I've been leading up our work together with our grassroots partner organizations in New York City on banning facial recognition in the city and exposing the ways in which the NYPD has used surveillance, in particular facial recognition, against Black Lives Matter protesters to harass them in often unwarranted and potentially unlawful ways, and to really hold them to account on the usage of this technology, which Amnesty believes by design is considered in violation of your very basic rights, including your rights to equality and non-discrimination in the way that the technology is often applied in biased ways, and also in terms of your right to privacy, because the technology, for those of you who don't know, depends on the curation of a large database of images without people's knowledge and consent, often scraped from, for example, social media or people's driver's licenses or other government databases. And this database is, in fact, crucial in order for the facial recognition software to be able to operate. And so without that database, it doesn't work. And because that database is necessary for the design of the technology, we believe it's a violation of people's right to privacy. And therefore, again, the technology is incompatible with your right to privacy. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, given the ways in which these technologies are often applied in context of protests, they're also risking affecting a chilling effect, which leads to people who believe they are subject to surveillance being less likely to exercise their basic right to protest because of fear of surveillance. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the New York City context, and I'm going to show a few slides. A part of what I'm trying to show here is how, whilst NGOs have been historically focused on publishing stories around how facial recognition has been used, and other similar tools have been used in often egregious ways, the ways in which we are sort of missing bringing people along with us is often rooted in, for example, not paying as much attention to bringing the audience in with us in the process of actually generating the research. So part of what Amnesty has done in this instance is actually try and develop a project, a campaign around the co-production of the research around facial recognition in the first place with the communities that we were advocating with. So the example involves the case of Derek Ingram, who was a Black Lives Matter protester who had been out protesting in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. He was subsequently sort of harassed by the police, in particular by the NYPD, who showed up at his door and harassed him for 4 hours without being able to produce a warrant. And journalists later captured a photo of a printout that one of the officers held outside of his apartment, which read facial recognition query, and it had his name and his face on it. And the police later on, having done a search, presumably with a facial recognition tool, posted an image of Derek from his private Instagram, as well as a photo captured of him during protest. Now, interestingly, in all of this, there was no charges against Derek until a little bit later, when the police came back and charged him for using the megaphone too closely to an officer's ear. And subsequently, we have, as Amnesty, reached out to the NYPD asking for information about how facial recognition is being used against BLM protesters in particular, as well as any procurement of facial recognition technology is done by the NYPD, but they have not come through with any of that information. And even following on an appeal, they rejected that appeal, and we were still in the dark at this stage. So what we did instead is we worked together with our group of partner organizations and used Google Street View API to pull all of the panoramas of every street intersection in New York City. And together with a recruited 7,500 volunteers from across 150 countries, we were able to tag cameras that plug into facial recognition software. So as you can see here, this is what a typical screen that would be faced by a volunteer would be looking like. So volunteers would be browsing a street, an intersection, and they would tag as many cameras as they could possibly find. Now, we were able to parse through this data, and having had 3 volunteers look at every street intersection, come to a number above 20,000 cameras across all of New York City, which is what you're seeing here. Some of them are private, some of them are public, and the ones that are public are the ones that plug into the facial recognition software that the NYPD runs. This scale of project and advocacy work would not have been possible if it wasn't for the fact that Amnesty was engaging with our very audience who are potentially affected by this technology in the actual production of the research. And it's led us to also be able to develop a tool that gives back to that community, insofar as any person can now go to our website and put in their address, a to and from address, and find out how much they're surveilled by these cameras along their routes. We were also able to generate insights such as the prevalence of facial recognition exposure in communities of color, of which there's a strong correlation, as well as to show that places and people that are more subject to stop and frisk by police are also more likely to be exposed to facial recognition. In closing, this data has also been used by us and our partners in a lawsuit against the NYPD, in particular, again, emphasizing the lack of transparency in the NYPD handing over this data to us around FRT usage in against Black Lives Matter protesters. And what we were able to get to was really a win, given that the New York Supreme Court ruled in our favor and ordered the NYPD to hand over these documents to us. They have since appealed the judgment, but we believe it's on thin ground and that we will be winning the appeal as well. These are just some ways that I'm suggesting that CSO should be working together with the communities that they look to serve to generate interesting insights that wouldn't otherwise be available to us. I'm going to stop here and looking forward to the next section. Over to you, Barbara.
Thank you, Matt. So everyone, I want to reiterate that you are very much encouraged to put a question into the chat as they occur to you. We'll come back to them toward the end of our time together, but you can add something. I see a couple questions have come in, so thank you. And we'll come back to those in a few minutes. But as you're listening, if something comes to mind, please put a question into the chat. So I will ask both Matt and Francesca now to turn on your cameras. And this is an opportunity during this dialogue for the most sort of dialogue-y part of the session, and that is for Matt and Francesca to reflect and ask each other questions, things that might have come up in your introductions, thoughts that occurred to you. So I'm going to open it to the two of you. Francesca, do you have a question for Matt? I think you mentioned that you had worked with Amnesty International in the past, so there's already a connection there. But thoughts or perspectives or questions that you have regarding what Matt shared?
Well, actually, yes, because this is also something that, I mean, we truly believe, and I mentioned it briefly before, about the need to have a sort of like collaborative approach when we tackle these issues. And for sure, when we talk about, like, for example, cyber threats, but also in the field of surveillance, I mean, no organization can do it alone. And one of the, for example, one of the decisions that we've taken with the CyberPeace Institute was first to start assisting other organizations, so not necessarily individuals, basically to have a sort of like wider, potentially a wider impact. So supporting the ones that are supporting human rights defenders and individuals and so on. So that was a little bit our take, but also to do this in collaboration with others. And this is why I mentioned Amnesty. I just wanted to know from Matt, if also, I mean, how is their experience in, like, for example, collaborating with the private sector? So how is the interaction? Because it's a key actor, I think, and not always, let's say, the collaboration is necessarily smooth, or let's say in the same term. So I just wanted to hear your views on this.
Thank you, Francesca, and thank you for your wonderful presentation and for the work that you've done. I have colleagues within our security lab who I'm sure you've worked with before. Yeah, just to give you an insight into how we think about, or how I, in particular, in my work, I can't speak for everyone, have been thinking about the private actors, and in particular private companies, given that so many of them, in particular in the space of remote biometric surveillance, so facial recognition, are embroiled in providing those tools, or in some ways not protecting themselves against potential scraping. We don't engage with them from a point of view of partnership, but that is from a point of view that is potentially slightly more adversarial, because we believe conversations that have been taken in a form of multi-stakeholder initiatives in the past, and various fora, including, for example, partnership on AI and other forum, have not been very effective. And it's been tending along the lines of developing AI principles or ethical principles around the use of AI, and those oftentimes are non-committal, unenforceable rules that don't lead to companies actually changing practices, and they lead to typically superficial changes in policy that may look like they are prohibiting, for example, the usage of facial recognition. But if you look into it, it turns out that actually very little in the back end has changed to stop it. And so our approach has been more one that is not too dissimilar to how we engage with states, which is to say, issue recommendations, expose the ways in which they have led to violations, and then hope that pressure potentially could lead to changes in practices, or sometimes, as was the case with NSO as well some time ago, and will be the case for future tech companies as well, and we're seeing now with Meta too, we will sue where possible and where we have linkages. And so, yeah, it's not one that is a partner-based approach, I would say, just because the space hasn't really lended to us. And I will say because of the actors being so embroiled in the violations themselves. But I'm curious about your own approach and thinking around that.
I'm not sure if Francesca has frozen. So Francesca, when you're able to, if you heard Matt, your thoughts on his response, but also, I love technology, so exciting. Something like this happens. All right, so Matt, it's you and I right now. We'll wait until Francesca's running again. But in listening to you, this might be a silly question, but I'm going to ask it because I wonder if others are thinking the same thing. As you talked about the use of the CCTV cameras in New York and how the NYPD was using that to target Black Lives Matter protesters. Have you seen similar things? I mean, New York City is not the only city in the world that has extensive CCTV use. Places like London come to mind, where the London police have often used CCTV footage to find criminals, but also, are you seeing the use of this in other places as well? And is it like, are the same sorts of actions being taken with police there, or what's happening in a broader sense beyond New York?
So I think one thing that's really important to emphasize before going into taking stock of that is that, it's not that we take issue with CCTV per se. The issue is with facial recognition. And I will say that the thing about CCTV is that oftentimes, especially with products that have been deployed in the last 10 to 15 years, you are looking at tools that really are just one software upgrade away from being capable of being used with facial recognition. And given that there's very little regulation that stops police forces from using facial recognition, a lot of modern cities are vulnerable to exactly what you're saying, to facial recognition and for its use with law enforcement purposes. Now, I also want to emphasize, and you mentioned potentially in the use of capturing criminals, there's actually no data that shows that facial recognition lowers or in any way affects crime rates. And I think that's really, really important to have up front, because the predominant argument that is being used by law enforcement is that facial recognition leads to lowering crime rates. But actually, it's an experiment, and it's a leap of faith that has been sort of leaping for the last 5 to 10 years, often promising to do more than it is actually capable of doing. Also, facial recognition doesn't actually change the biases held by police. So if there's discriminatory practices of policing happening in law enforcement units, then those only stand to be emphasized and augmented by the use of facial recognition, which is at the disposal of these same officers that are potentially acting in discriminatory ways. Now, there are other cities in which this is playing out. London is one of them, as you mentioned, where Big Brother Watch in particular has done excellent work challenging the use of both public and private facial recognition. We have also looked at Hyderabad in India, in particular in Telangana state, where we've challenged the setup of the command and control tower, which looks to connect thousands, upwards of 200,000 cameras across the whole state for use with real-time facial recognition. And we're also starting to look at the ways in which this potentially plays out in the occupied Palestinian territories and in other states across the world. Now, this is a global phenomenon, and the actors are plentiful and not just based in one country either. So it is a difficult thing to raise the bar around, and it's a difficult thing to regulate across the world. But there is some promising signs of potential change in attitude, not least in the EU AI Act, which is the European Union's sort of flagship regulation on artificial intelligence, which in combination with Germany's call to ban facial recognition, for example, shows a pathway towards the elimination of the usage, at least in some contexts, though there are obviously always going to be exemptions, which we will continue to fight against. But yes, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, it really does, because yeah, it's what came to mind in listening to you, and I imagine others were probably thinking similarly. So thanks for explaining that and broadening the scope. That's really helpful. So one question that also comes to mind is that you're working on different forms of surveillance, targeted surveillance by way of spyware, and mass and discriminatory surveillance by way of biometrics. Are there similar solutions to keeping both at bay? What's the perspective on that?
So I'm really hoping that Francesca will pop up any moment now, because I was really curious about her answer to this as well. From where I stand, a call for a global ban on both is essentially the way forward. And I think, until states, and in particular, cities have played a large role, at least for facial recognition, in setting the standards for what a ban could look like. Until we see those kinds of movements globally, where we're unlikely to see a sort of a shrinking of the space available for actors to liberally use these tools, whether it's targeted surveillance, that Francesca is looking at, such as spyware, or whether it's biometric surveillance like facial recognition in my instance. Now, Amnesty has called for a blanket ban on facial recognition technologies for identification. And I know that we're also calling for a moratorium on spyware. But I'm curious to hear from Francesca and also from folks in the audience as well, in the chat perhaps, what their thoughts are on how we move the lever on this. From where I stand, it's all down to prohibition, but that's just me.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that. And as Matt said, please feel free to use the chat to throw your thoughts into the mix. And you don't have to just ask questions. You can also voice your opinion and your thoughts. So Francesca, are you able to join us even without your camera on?
Okay.
Oh,
Now
there you are.
the
Wonderful.
host, yeah, apologies for that. Actually, just to let you know that in the whole building, there is a Wi-Fi blackout. So I'm hotspotting from my phone. So let's hope, fingers crossed. Also in Geneva is happening. Anyway, so.
Oh my goodness. Well,
yes.
We're glad that you're back and able to reconnect.
Yes, and
Sorry,
yeah,
go ahead.
I just heard what Matt was mentioning, and maybe, I mean, just providing a couple of resources. Indeed, what I was mentioning is that I mean, I'm trying to pick it up from what Matt was saying, and
I could repeat the question for you if you'd like. Then you can have the full. Okay. So the question was that if since you're working on different forms of surveillance, targeted surveillance by way of spyware, and mass and discriminatory surveillance by way of biometrics, are there similar solutions to keeping both at bay? And Matt, of course, said prohibition on both was his perspective on that. And so he and we are all curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, actually, I think Matt already mentioned that indeed the position has been since the very beginning for the Institute, but also joining, for example, last time in May 2022, so last May, we joined, for example, Access Now, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and the International Trade Union Confederation and Consumers International to call on decision makers to take action and basically initiate indeed a moratorium, basically to limit the sale, the transfer, and the use of abusive spyware until people's rights are safeguarded under international human rights law. I just want to mention something regarding what Matt was mentioning when, unfortunately, I drop off. So I agree with you in terms of let's say the relationship with the private sector is not always, let's say, easy, specifically because often they are kind of like the cause and the solution in a way of the problem. What I think might be a sort of kind of at least our experience is indeed, first of all, to join forces with other civil society organizations, but also to try to establish a dialogue, basically with the private sector. I have to say that when it comes to spyware, for example, there is also an interest from, let's say, legitimate companies in order, let's say, to play their role as well. And I have a practical example, and this is a resource, maybe I can also share it in the chat. We did some work within a specific forum that is called the European Cyber Agora, where basically we led a multi-stakeholder group, both of civil society and private sector companies, in basically try to understand what is the role of the multi-stakeholder community in addressing, for example, the spyware market, and support the policymakers in understanding. One of the roles that I think the civil society can play is, on one hand, basically to assume a sort of responsible position in terms of informing their communities, partnering up with other civil society organizations that might not be that aware. And this is a little bit what we're doing, but also kind of translating this knowledge for policymakers that are often, either not aware or they need to understand the real impact that this type of attacks, either cyber attacks or, for example, targeted surveillance, is having on people. Because what I see, and I've been working in the cybersecurity, let's say, ecosystem for many, many years, is that often what policymakers get are kind of like numbers of attacks, damages, economic losses, and so on and so forth. Not enough, they get the real meaning of the harm that these type of measures are causing to people, to civil society organization, and to individuals. So this is a bit let's say the type of, let's say, the gap that we are trying to fill, also in working with private sector actors, basically, to give a little bit more meaning of what's happening in reality to people, basically.
Yeah, Matt, do you want to respond to that? Do you have thoughts on her response to you?
Sure. Thanks, Barb, and thanks, Francesca. I'm glad that you were able to get back on. In brief, you know, I think there's something to be said about private sector relaying information that is useful for the context of advocacy, in particular for informing how we understand certain things. I think that relationship has to be managed very, very carefully. And I think from our perspective, it has often been a matter of we ask questions on the back of serious allegations and investigations into the said company. And hopefully they are either collaborative and provide us with information that attempts to refute it, but perhaps reveals more than they bargained for, or blanket refute it, in which case, you know, like, there's either a case to be made for greater transparency from that company, or even greater reason for us to continue hammering home the points that we're making. I think the reason why I'm a little skeptical about the approach with private sector engagement, or the reason why I want to emphasize being so careful with it, is also because, again, so many of the industries that we're attempting to regulate, their entire economic model is one that is based on the allowance of the uses of these tools in the way that they are by states who act in semi-authoritarian ways in different contexts, or in the uses by companies and other actors who use these tools, or again, by law enforcement authorities who use these tools in ways that are in violation of human rights, because they were designed to be in violation of human rights, because they were designed for spying, they were designed to be anti-privacy, they were designed to be tools of mass surveillance. There's nothing about their economy that is compatible with human rights. And so the idea that private sector would be involved in a conversation or involved in a process that is fundamentally looking to create a prohibitive environment for their particular market is one in which they are bound to take up survivalist methods and engage with us from a position of again that is adversarial necessarily. So I think from my perspective, and I come at this wearing two hats, right? I've got my Amnesty hat on one hand, and I've got my academic hat on the other as a critical race and digital scholar. And my approach has always been like it's all about the sort of structure that undergirds the development of these tools. And so long as this particular laissez-faire approach to tech development exists, so long as there is money to be made off of spying on marginalized communities, human rights defenders, etc., like no amount of engagement with private sector is going to get us anywhere. Which is again why I'm pushing for this prohibitive approach. But I also appreciate that getting information from the inside is tremendously helpful, which is also why we've set up channels and work with tech workers who are whistleblowing and who are siphoning information from inside the company, really able to engage with us on what is happening on the inside. Timnit Gebru set a phenomenal precedent when she left Google. And there are a number of other sort of contexts, including the No Tech for Apartheid campaign, in which other tech workers have also come out and spoken against the practices within their company, and in so doing, given us greater insight on what goes on inside these companies. But I'll leave it there. I've been monologuing for a while. I really appreciate this conversation.
Can you just quickly comment on this? Because actually you mentioned something that is extremely relevant, which is the business model. And this is why, for example, we also thought, especially because there are already there's a tremendous work done by civil society organizations when it comes, for example, to spyware. So we said how we can contribute. And for example, in January, we will start specifically a research project. So I will pick your brain, and if anyone in the in the chat is willing to help, please drop me a line, because we will start this project on analyzing the spyware market. So trying to understand the market dynamics, which are the incentives, and which are the economic leverage. And so, because it's not, the market is very opaque. It's a matter of like regulatory approach, but it's also a matter of like what is happening concretely when it comes to the business model. And so this is also a way that we are trying to contribute basically in producing knowledge. And it's extremely relevant what you mentioned about the business model, because, for example, when we were working on the Cyber Agora report that I mentioned, one of our kind of like recommendation was indeed also, for example, to think about the role of investors. The role that investors can play in overseeing the practices, for example, of spyware companies they fund. And we don't need to reinvent the wheel, meaning that we already have, for example, a human rights due diligence guide for investors. We have like human rights framework, then unfortunately they are not respected. So not necessarily we need kind of like invent, let's say, other tools. We need to apply what is out there. To apply what is out there, and this is where I go back to the need to raise awareness, is that often people do not even know basically that these tools exist. And especially in the civil society realm, we need to enhance, I think, the knowledge in terms of like the threats that they might face, but those are the solutions that might be already out there. So I think that part of the advocacy is not only with the different actors, like, for example, policymakers or with the private sector community, but also within the community in itself. And to this point, also, when you were talking about like also the tools, so basically the private sector companies are producing, I mentioned before the program that we have to assist other civil society organizations, the CyberPeace Builders, by which we offer free cybersecurity support to other civil society organizations. One of the challenges that we face is that most of the tools that we and they are using are proprietary tools, obviously. And one of the things that we started discussing also with the different civil society organization is we need to have tools that are also thought with the civil society needs in mind, taking into consideration, for example, the sensitive context that they are operating in. For example, we did a lot of work with the peace mediators. So their needs might be very different from, I don't know, like organization working, in developing countries for, building schools, or so it's really a different type of sensitivity of, managing data, but also like physical exposure to potential threats. And so we also started thinking, this is why in January, we will launch a humanitarian cybersecurity center that is not only providing assistance, but is also developing tools together with the community for, better targeting the needs of civil society. And then I don't know, Barbara, if we still have, let's say, one minute, but I'm eager to hear from Matti. We still have time, like how you see also the kind of like capacity building angle. So I see there is often an issue with like financial resources for civil society organization, but often it's also a matter of like skills and getting to know that you need to get some skills, I would call them cyber related skills, not only to better understand the ecosystem, but also to properly work. The everyday work. What you think about this?
Barbara, I'm just
yes, jump in, Matt.
Thank you, Francesca. I hear you on capacity building. I think I like to use a term that, to my knowledge, was coined by Alex Dunn, which is the idea of technical intuition, as opposed to, technical insight and technical knowledge. And the reason why I say that is because the idea that you must have some amount of programmatic knowledge or computer science education has often tended to sort of cast this big gap between civil society and, the general public, and then those who are experts in the field of computation, on technology, AI, what have you. And that really serves to exacerbate the issue of apathy, right? Because if you know that there's a big gap between you and attaining the knowledge that even qualifies you to look at certain systems, then you're far less likely to engage in debates and discourses around those systems. And so I call it technical intuition because I don't think it requires extensive technical knowledge to understand what the impact of a system is. And I think fundamentally, there are two ways of getting there. One of them is, first of all, understanding that what we're looking to do is not necessarily expose the black box and look through the code and understand what the code itself says about how the system operates. I think we have to expand our definition of the black box to encompass the societal impacts that the tools has, because really the societal impacts is the nature of the tool. The tool itself doesn't matter, but when the tool is being used in practice, we really see the nature of it. And so understanding the tool phenomenologically is the best way for us to understand what the tool is. And I think anyone can look at how facial recognition is being used if you give them tools to visualize where they are and how it might be more difficult to walk around in sites of protest without being exposed. Anyone can understand how spyware can be problematic if you can walk people through the scenario of suddenly everything is being watched when you're trying to dissent against an authoritarian government. There are many different scenarios that can be built up using human stories that really gets us to the technical intuition that isn't so wound up with understanding the technical system as purely a technical system, but as a socio-technical system instead. The other thing that we can do, which is partly what we're trying to do with our facial recognition work, is to involve volunteers and human rights supporters at large, people who care about the right to protest, people who care about racial justice, in the process of co-producing research. Because as we kind of show through the Decode Surveillance NYC project, you neither need to be a surveillance expert, not even a human rights expert. You don't need to be a technical expert in any form at all in order to be able to help us tag these cameras and then look at the impact that it has after the fact using your data. But as you're walking through the process of actually tagging these cameras, you're also being given hints and clues about, why these systems are problematic in cases in which it has been used against different protesters. And these systems, the system that we use was also co-designed with the very communities that thought that their community would be potentially a little apathetical to this. And so what we did was also, instead of framing this as is often the tendency in the civil society space when it comes to tech and race, instead of framing this as a privacy issue, we also made it very clear that this was an issue of racial justice, because you can't have racial justice so long as tools that enable racial discrimination exist. And so making it more relevant to people's everyday life, tapping into that technical intuition that we know people already have, as long as they're not being told that these conversations can only be had above their heads. And then also working on ways in which people can be brought into the actual research design process, I think are effective ways in which we counter some of the things that you're referring to, Francesca. At least that's been my experience.
I'm going to have to stop this wonderful conversation here only so that we can, because we're getting toward the end of our time, and there's a couple questions from viewers that I think are great in taking this into beyond where we've been talking and shifting into sort of, okay, so then what can some of these civil societies do, and what are some of the action points? And that would be a great place to finish out. So first, there's a question from Rand. And he says, what do you see as advocacy avenues to push for a moratorium on digital surveillance technology? So if you both got thoughts, I'd love to hear that briefly. If one of you has got something really strong that and then we'll shift it around to the question from Susie after that. So would either of you like to take on the advocacy avenues for the moratorium?
I would just maybe super briefly comment. I mean, UN, different forms and shape. So meaning, for example, we are very active at the open-ended working group, but also thinking about all the kind of like more intersectional approach, and where you might have like multi-stakeholder communities. And that's why before I mentioned, for example, we just had in Geneva the UN and I mean the business and human rights meetings. So all those groups where you can continue to advocate basically as a community, potentially, I mean, hopefully multi-stakeholder community, and to a wider audience, I think it's definitely an avenue. I mentioned specifically the work that we would start in January, because this will also kind of like produce some knowledge that we can use to have even more evidence-led knowledge to foster the advocacy work. And yes, so in a nutshell, continue to advocate for it at the UN and state level.
Great. And the other question from Susie was, and this is shifting into AI and the lack of public understanding about the current and near future impact on rights. How can public awareness and engagement be increased? How can the public be brought into the design and deployment of AI and emerging technologies? Matt, are you able to address this one? Would you like to?
Yeah. So I think, certainly from a biometrics perspective, and that might be slightly different to where we sit on the targeted surveillance front via spyware. So long as the particular intervention we're looking at is citywide or city-based, I think it makes it a lot easier to tackle at that level. And so one really successful advocacy avenue that we have seen, certainly in the United States, has been at the city level. We've seen, Portland, Oregon, San Francisco. We've seen Cambridge in Massachusetts, Somerville, regulate against facial recognition and really put in citywide bans of the usage of facial recognition, knowing that their cities were also, the host to many Black Lives Matter protests. And a lot of these bans came out on the back of that. And we also saw at New York State level, not at the city level and not comprehensively, but nevertheless, a ban on the use of facial recognition at schools, which is also, again, really crucial given the changing discourse towards the use of facial recognition to somehow stop or find, individuals who carry guns and potentially engage in gun violence. Now, we all know that the issue of gun violence is one that's sort of reached an interesting point in the United States, where, of course, the issue is the regulation of guns and ammunition, and not so much, do we use technology to solve the issue, because the issue won't go away so long as folks are allowed to carry arms. But that's a different story entirely. It's just to highlight the fact that there tends to be a sort of a solutionist approach to thinking about technology as a panacea that can, solve a lot of the issues that we're dealing with at the societal level. But yeah, I think citywide advocacy has tended to be what we've seen as the most effective. And frankly, we've seen less effective engagement at the international level and through international organizations. And I think the EU AI Act is the first space in which we might see some advances on this front, as I mentioned before as well.
Okay, thanks. And unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap it up here. I know that we've really hit a great stride, and that's what you can always feel in the great dialogues, that once you get through, that you could find yourself talking for another 30 minutes. But thank you so much. Thank you so much, Francesca and Matt, for joining us today and for inspiring us and giving us new perspectives, maybe to think about what all of this has to do with us and action points that we can take. Thank you so much to the international sign interpreters and our captioner for their work. I know there were some glitches. Day, you've been a champion, so thank you so much for hanging in there. And thanks to all of you who've joined us from around the world. All of the dialogues from 2022 are now available as videos and audio on the Center's YouTube and podcast channels.